Welcome to Global Perspectives. In today's episode, we're delving into the depths of the Arctic and the Third Pole, exploring the complex nexus of science, law, and culture in these remote regions. As temperatures rise and ice recedes, the Arctic and the Hindu Kush Himalayan region stand at the forefront of climate change, facing unprecedented challenges that transcend borders. From Greenland to the highlands of Tibet, from Norway to Nepal, the impact of a warming planet are being felt by millions, making this not just a regional concern, but a transnational issue of global significance. Joining us today is a distinguished guest whose expertise illuminates this terrain. Dr. Kamrul Hussein, a visionary in the field of environmental law and a driving force for change in the Arctic. Dr. Hossain serves as the Director and Research Professor at the Northern Institute of Environmental and Minority Law, housed within the esteemed Arctic Center at the University of Lapland, Finland. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hussein.
Thank you so much, and I'm very happy to be here.
As we embark on this expedition, what do you see as the most pressing concern that emerges from the realms of the Arctic and the Third Pole today?
The temperature rise in the Arctic and the Third Pole is disproportionate. It is said that temperature rise in the Arctic and also in the Third Pole is 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. So if we cannot stabilize the temperature rise, it will have huge impact not only for the Arctic or the Third Pole, but also for the globe at large. To give you an example, in next 20 to 30 years, 40% of the Greenlandic ice sheet will melt. So that will come down to the sea, so sea level will be rising. If we consider the Third Pole, where already 40% of the glaciers are shrunk by now, and if we cannot stabilize the temperature rise, the impact will be much worse in the coming future.
Do you envision a possibility of seeing the Arctic and the Third Pole not just as areas facing climate change, but as living laboratories from where we can derive solutions that can help us adapt to climate change problems worldwide?
But for specific solutions, of course, there are traditional knowledge used in both regions in regard to different kind of practices. If I bring the example of the Third Pole, ice to pass is one of the climate intervention method developed through traditional knowledge. That could be probably implemented in a larger scale. And by the way, ice to pass, it is about creating artificial glaciers for winter water security for irrigation and for other purpose. So that could be probably promoted in a larger scale. And that could be one concrete example of climate intervention.
Have you ever considered reframing indigenous knowledge in the Arctic and the Third Pole such that it becomes not just a local asset, but a source of global wisdom?
In the Arctic, indigenous knowledge is hugely valued, and it is valued within the framework of institutions. So in the Arctic, we have several institutions that are working at the interstate level, and also local actors are participating. Just to give you an example of Arctic Council. So this is an intergovernmental forum of 8 Arctic states, where state parties are the main actor, but at the same time, indigenous peoples, they participate as actors, as non-state actors, and they sit together with the states. So they work together and discuss issues and adopt decisions where indigenous people, they are called, indigenous peoples representations are there from all across the Arctic region. So they are called permanent participants. So it's a kind of the terminology used within the framework of Arctic Council, and their indigenous knowledge is communicated in the decision-making process. So the value of indigenous knowledge has been very much recognized within the framework of Arctic Council processes. So it means that indigenous people's knowledge is to some extent institutionalized. So I think that is very important, and that can be something the other region could learn. For example, in the Third Pole, it could learn the lessons from the Arctic Council, how indigenous peoples or even other local non-state actors can be engaged.
Do you see a possibility where the shared security of the Arctic and the Third Pole become a basis for international collaboration in the future?
That is something we call human security. And actually, as I come from the Arctic cooperation established from human security concerns in the way that the establishment of Arctic cooperation was based on environmental protection of the Arctic and to promote sustainable development. So it was in the beginning of 1991 when Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy was developed, and that has transformed into Arctic Council in 1996. And the basis was, as I said, that environmental cooperation on environmental issues that provides, human security concerns. So that is a very important point to bring states together to develop strategies together, and that actually provide very good international cooperation network, and that also provide incentive for other collaboration in other bigger issues. So I think that is very important from the Arctic context. And also in the third pole, as we know, that International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, is also an organization which is called a political organization, science cooperation organization, and that is also an international or intergovernmental organization of 8 states from the region. And they are also collaborating on these soft security issues where human concerns, biodiversity loss, pollution, climate change are important and are discussed in both venues. And as we were talking about the similarities between Arctic and the third pole, especially in regard to the concerns that are occurring from the impacts of climate change, I see huge potential to even promote broader political level cooperation, having human security concerns as the basis.
Dr. Hussein, can you talk us through the problem of food security in the Arctic?
Food security has 4 components. So first let us talk about these 4 components before we see how it applies to the Arctic. So these 4 components are accessibility, food is easily accessible, affordability, so people have the capacity to access to food, physical capacity, financial capacity. Then sustainability, supply of food is sustainable. And another part is utilization, which is about meeting the dietary needs of the people who are concerned. So in the Arctic, food security does not apply everywhere equally. So in North American Arctic, it applies differently than in the Nordic Arctic. So one issue is infrastructure. In the Nordic Arctic, infrastructure is well developed. So therefore, utilization part is the main concern, to have the food for meeting the dietary requirements for the people. And it is because the food you can receive from natural resources are abundant in many cases in the Nordic part of the Arctic. And that is because that is more expensive than what you can buy from the supermarket or from the store. And infrastructure is so well developed that you can buy food with cheaper means that come from the south. Mm-hmm. So their utilization part is missing. That brings the food insecurity for the people in the Nordic Arctic. But in Canadian Arctic, you can find all 4 components. So that offer, in many cases, food insecurity in many different ways for the people living in the North American Arctic. So one example is, for example, thinning ice. That causes problem for hunters who are hunting using ice as a ground for food, so they cannot go far away to hunt. And also it is about, rescue, search and rescue thing, because if they are trapped in a floating ice somewhere in the middle of the ocean, it's very difficult for them to be rescued. Another problem is contamination. So contamination is very common because of oil spills or pollution coming from microplastics or invasive species. So that affect the food chain.
Owing to your expertise in environmental law, can you talk us through the specific legal challenges related to the environment in the Arctic?
Because of the impact of climate change, Arctic is melting faster and faster. So Arctic water is opening up and new human activities are being in place in the Arctic, oil and gas activities. And as you know, the shipping routes are more open and it is more used, especially Northern Sea route is more used. It is very easily accessible and it reduces time, energy and also distance. So that brings elements like pollution, vessel source pollution, for example. So shipping is one of the issues here. And there are regulations for shipping. For example, marine pollution, MARPOL Convention is one of the international convention that provide protection from vessel source pollution. That applies to Arctic. But then in the Arctic context, Polar Code was adopted in 2017, and Polar Code actually regulates some of the issues, especially shipping activities. So it provides, specific ice class ships and requirements for using specific ice class ships and safety issues and also pollution from vessels. But unfortunately, Polar Code has not regulated heavy fuel, use of heavy fuel, and that is one of the challenge. That is one of the challenge in the Arctic context. But then now negotiation is in place to have provision to ban use of heavy fuel in the Arctic. So that is one regulatory challenge in the Arctic. But then there are other issues also. For example, grey water is not regulated through the Polar Code. So grey water means, the microplastics that you find from the use of washing machine, bathtub, sinks. So they are discharged to Arctic waters. And as I said, that they contain microplastics and that affect living resources, for example, in the Arctic. So these are two specific legal challenges, as I can say. And then there are other challenges as well in regard to oil and gas activities. So there is an agreement adopted within the auspices of the Arctic Council. It's generally called Arctic Oil Spill Agreement. And that agreement provides the cooperation in terms of oil spill. So when there is an oil spill, it is kind of an emergency preparedness program. So that regulatory framework offer, preparedness aspect, but not proactive provisions before, how you conduct oil and gas activities. There are some guidelines, but there are no binding regulations on the conduct of oil and gas activities in the Arctic. So these are few examples of specific regulatory challenges that we see in the Arctic.
Why do you think it is necessary to take mitigation and adaptation together?
Because even if we have this mitigation target fulfilled, it will not save us. So we need to cope with the changes. We need to live with the changes that are happening. So we have to have proactive strategies how to recover from the changes. So we have to be more resilient. And to become more resilient, we need to have, proactive approaches, proactive strategies, proactive measures to integrate or to develop. So this will need to be worked together. I think we cannot just rely on mitigation process. We have to also at the same time adopt adaptation strategies.
When you say proactive measures, what do you specifically mean? Can you give us an example?
By proactive measures, what I mean is to act in order to reduce the emission of greenhouse gas. And that can be done in all levels, not only at the state level, but that has to be done also at the local and individual level.
So we just talked about how action is necessary at individual level, community level, government level, and in international level. Do you see any systematic or political barrier that might act as a hindrance to this?
Major contributors to the climate change are the developed countries, US, Japan, and nowadays India, Russia, China. China is the biggest emitter. So I think it's a global responsibility, but then it's also a differentiated responsibility. All the states and all the actors are not at the same level, do not have the same capacity. Some states have more capacity than the other state. Some states have more kind of technological advancement, where other states, especially developing countries, they don't have that technological advancement. So I think responsibility has to be shared equitably and also ethically as well. So developed countries do have more responsibility because they are the biggest emitter. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they have to help the developing countries, those who are not even the big emitter and big contributor to the greenhouse gas emission, to act in such a way that we can globally act together to combat climate change.
What are the steps they can take? Because climate change is not just a global issue, it's a human rights issue. For example, the people who least contribute to climate change are the ones that face the worst effects of climate change. So how do you think in this context the developing countries can take responsibility or be accountable for that?
So this is a climate justice issue. We have regulatory mechanisms, and we cannot apply regulatory mechanisms equally for all the states. So there, as I said, that we need to have some equitable consideration so that developing countries and developed countries could work together, and then they support each other in different ways. So financial contribution is one of the things which is nowadays called climate financing. So to take actions at different levels for the developing countries, climate change regulatory mechanism has a system of financing climate action projects. So this is one example. But then, as I said, that it is a global responsibility, and responsibility has to be carried out by all actors in a differentiated way.
Is the perceived distance between the reality and our thoughts a major cause to our lack of climate action?
To some extent, yes. I think we need to promote awareness, and we need to promote awareness on the sources of climate change and how it impacts our everyday life. And people-to-people cooperation and people-to-people exchange of knowledge, and at the same time, creating platform so that discussions on the impacts of climate change that we are facing every day, like cyclones, other natural disasters, typhoons, tsunami, or even forest fires. So those are happening so frequently, and so they are very important, to share knowledge among the people that these are the causes of climate change that we see. So we have to relate to that. Maybe we don't relate to that. We just think that this is just natural, this happens. So there I think we have room to improve awareness and education.
We've talked about the factors regarding climate change. We've talked about how mitigation is important, prevention is important. And after all this, what do you think is the glimmer of hope that's illuminating the path forward for these interconnected worlds?
We need to work closely with each other. We need to learn from each other. We need to collaborate with each other, not only within the border, but also across border. We need to learn about the changes that we were discussing, the changes, what is happening in the Arctic, changes, what is happening in the third pole Himalayan region, and how these changes are interconnected, how these changes affect our planet as a whole. So these are the issues we need to share. We need to develop our understanding around these issues, and also we need to focus on natural environment. For example, we were talking a lot about cryosphere. So it's a non-human object. So how relationality works together, human, non-human relation that support ecological support system of our planet. So those are the issues we need to work together. We need to learn. We need to promote our knowledge around this, and we need to also connect them, how they affect whole climate system and the globe.
We've talked about the factors influencing climate change. We've talked about mitigation, adaptation, and how economy and development are important aspects that contribute to climate change. So now that we've talked about all of this, what do you see as a glimmer of hope on the horizon that's illuminating the path forward for these interconnected worlds?
We need to work together. We need to learn from each other. We need to share our knowledge from all levels. We need to learn the challenges that communities are facing at the local level. And we need to also learn how communities are reacting, what kind of local solutions they have, and how this local solution and local challenges are interconnected when we approach from the top, when you see from the top. So there should be a merger between top-down and bottom-up approaches. And then also, as you said, we need to look at interconnectivity. We are talking a lot here about Arctic and the third pole, and we need to understand even though Arctic and South Pole are far apart from each other, why they are interconnected, how they are interconnected, how societies are affected because of the changes happening in both regions. And both regions are transnationally located regions. They are not within one country, one single country. They encompass across border spaces. So those are the things we need to learn. And also we need to learn non-human object and talk about the rights of existence of non-human object. For example, we are talking about cryosphere, and cryosphere melt is evident as we see because of the impact of climate change. But we need to also think that cryosphere has a right to exist. So these are the issues, I think, around which we should develop and promote our knowledge and share our understanding. They could provide us hope to work together to combat the challenges that we are facing.
Thank you for this insightful and informative conversation. It was an honor having you here today.
Thank you so much.
Namaste.
Namaste.
As the world deals with escalating climate crisis, the Hindu Kush Himalayan and the Arctic regions serve as reminders of interconnectedness of the Earth system. The fate of these regions is inevitably linked to the fate of humanity, underscoring the urgent need for transformative measures. As we come to the close of the first season of Global Perspectives, I find myself filled with gratitude. Throughout this season, we've dived into the depths of the global issues and the heights of human resilience. But throughout this, one thing has remained abundantly clear: the power of conversation, of empathy, and of understanding. So until we meet again for our next season, remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Let's harness this momentum to drive real change, because together we are not just observers, but architects for a better world. Namaste.